The vote passed 229 to 192. The National Park Service had already said no, arguing that the collection was second-rate, that the locomotives had no meaningful connection to the site, and that the money could be spent elsewhere. Congress spent it anyway. By 1993, the federal government had committed $66 million to build a railroad museum in downtown Scranton, Pennsylvania. And at the center of that museum, on a track it would never leave again, sat one of the most powerful steam locomotives ever built. A machine designed to haul 3,600-ton freight trains over the Wasatch Mountains without a helper engine, frozen in place so the public could look at it. The man who made it happen was Representative Joseph McDade, Scranton native, 30-year congressman, master of the congressional earmark. He secured the initial appropriation of $8 million in 1986 by attaching it to spending bills before the National Historic Site had received formal congressional authorization. The National Park Service conducted its historical significance review afterward rather than before, which reversed the standard process for designating a National Historic Site. Critics at the time included the director of the American Association of Museums and members of the National Park Service's own historical staff, who noted that most of the locomotives in the Blunt collection were industrial switches rather than the mainline passenger or freight engines most associated with American railroad history, and that the big boy itself, the collection's centerpiece, had spent its entire working life in Utah and Wyoming with no operational history in Pennsylvania whatsoever. The House voted 229 to 192 to fund the operating budget in 1994. McDade kept the funding coming. The locomotive at the center of the debate is Union Pacific Big Boy number 4012. On June 17, 2026, an identical machine from the same factory in the same month and year, using the same blueprints, pulls into the yard next to it under its own power, for the first time since both locomotives were built in Schenectady 85 years ago. What happens in that rail yard is the only moment in history where the decision and the accident stand in the same frame. That story starts on the floor of a plant in upstate New York. Subscribe to American Iron Works so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, when you see what that $66 million actually bought, does the math change? The American Locomotive Company operated out of Schenectady, New York, and in the early months of 1941, the plant was running at full capacity. Union Pacific had placed an order the previous year for a new class of locomotive, 25 machines, each one purpose-built to solve a single problem on a single stretch of track. The Wasatch Mountains in Utah produced a ruling grade of 1.14% on the eastbound climb between Ogden and Green River, Wyoming. That grade sounds modest until you attach numbers to it. A 3,600-ton freight train on a 1.14% grade requires approximately 82,000 pounds of continuous drawbar pull just to keep moving, not to accelerate, not to climb faster, simply to not stop. A loaded freight car on that grade, if the locomotive releases it, rolls backward. The standard workhorse of the Union Pacific system in 1941 was the 4-6-6-4 Challenger, a large, well-regarded articulated locomotive producing roughly 97,000 pounds of tractive effort at low speed. On the Wasatch grade, it could handle part of the load. It could not handle all of it. Union Pacific ran helper engines behind trains on the mountain territory, a second crew pushing from the rear, the two locomotives communicating by whistle signal across whatever distance of freight cars separated them. Two locomotives, two crews, twice the fuel, twice the maintenance, coordination overhead of running helper engines on mountain territory where timing had to be exact. The math was simple and the solution was not. Union Pacific's chief mechanical officer, Otto Jabelmann, adapted the Challenger design by adding a second set of 8 driving wheels behind the first, extending the boiler forward to accommodate the extra power demand, and articulating the 2 engine sets at a single hinge pin that weighed 450 pounds on its own. The frame was hinged because a rigid locomotive 132 feet long cannot navigate the curves of mountain railroad territory. The hinge is not a compromise. It is the engineering condition that makes the rest of the machine possible. The result was a locomotive that pulled a 3,600-ton train over Sherman Hill without a helper. A single crew, a single machine. 300 pounds per square inch of boiler pressure distributed across 16 driving wheels, each 68 inches in diameter. The class was meant to be called the Wasatch. Somewhere on the floor of the Schenectady plant, during assembly of one of the first units, a worker picked up a piece of chalk and wrote 2 words across the front of a smoke box. Big Boy. The foreman did not erase it. Union Pacific could have painted over it. The name was not in any engineering document, not in any purchase order, not in the original specifications Jaberman had submitted. It was a joke written by a man whose name was never recorded onto a machine that would haul military freight across the western United States through the second half of World War II. The name survived everything. It survived the transition to diesel. It survived the retirement of the entire class in 1959. It survived the congressional hearings about whether a museum built around one of them was worth $66 million of public money. When that museum opened its doors in Scranton, the locomotives on display had plaques that said, Big Boy. When Union Pacific restored 4014 to operation in 2019, the press releases said, Big Boy. When the National Park Service announced the June 2026 reunion at Steamtown, the event is called the Big Boy Reunion. The chalk worker's name appears on none of it. In November 1941, the American Locomotive Company delivered locomotives 4012 and 4014 to Union Pacific as part of the first batch of the class. Both went west. Both went to work on the same route between Ogden and Green River. Both accumulated mileage against the same grade at the same speed, doing the same job. Each of the first 20 Big Boys delivered had logged more than 1 million revenue miles by the time the class was retired. 4014 completed its final revenue run on July 21, 1959, with 1,031,205 miles on its record. Union Pacific officially retired the locomotive on December 7, 1961. The following January, the Southern California chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society accepted 4014 as a donation from Union Pacific and placed it on display at the Los Angeles County Fairgrounds in Pomona, California. In the early 1960s, Union Pacific donated locomotive 4012 to a railroad enthusiast named F. Nelson Blount, a Rhode Island seafood industrialist who had been assembling one of the largest private collections of vintage steam locomotives in American history. Blount had established his museum, Steamtown, USA, in Vermont. He had to formally incorporate the Steamtown Foundation as a non-profit specifically to receive the Big Boy donation, because Union Pacific required institutional accountability before transferring a machine of that scale. Otherwise, it would be scrapped. That institutional accountability eventually carried 4012 from Vermont to Scranton in 1984. Blount had died in 1967. The foundation that bore his name went bankrupt in 1986. A congressman from Scranton saw an opportunity and tacked $8 million onto a spending bill. $66 million funded a working turntable, a reconstructed 1902 roundhouse, a visitor center, a technology museum, a history museum, a theater showing a short film about the steam era, and a yard full of locomotives, including one Big Boy, which was painted, maintained, and never moved under its own power again. 4014 sat in Pomona for 52 years. Pomona has a dry climate. The Southern California chapter maintained the locomotive carefully. It stayed outdoors, but the desert air did not punish the metal the way Pennsylvania winters punish iron left in the open. In 1990, the Rail Giants Museum was relocating 4014 to a new display area within the Los Angeles County Fairgrounds. The crew laid temporary track sections across the parking lot and began moving the locomotive. 4014 moved so easily, it got away from them. The 1.25 million pound machine, stationary since 1959, rolled under gravity along the temporary track and struck the tender of a Santa Fe Hudson locomotive parked nearby. The crew left them in contact overnight while they planned the repositioning. When they returned the next morning, the Santa Fe had slowly rolled partway off the end of the temporary track on its own. A locomotive that had not turned a wheel in 30 years was still mechanically willing to move. That willingness is what Union Pacific was looking for in 2012, when the railroad began planning for the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad's completion in 2019. The railroad wanted an operational big boy for the celebration and evaluated all 8 surviving examples. The 2 Union Pacific-owned machines, on display in Cheyenne and in Omaha, had spent decades exposed to Wyoming and Nebraska winters. The results showed. 4014, by contrast, had been well maintained in a climate that forgave iron. Geography had made the decision before Union Pacific formally made it. Getting 4014 from Pomona back to Cheyenne required a procedure that railroaders documented and that railroad historians still recount. Union Pacific sent what the crew called a hospital train, 14 cars dispatched from Cheyenne to Pomona, loaded with machine tools, replacement parts, and the last generation of steam engineers who had worked on big boys when they were in active service. The crew spent 3 months at the fairgrounds replacing the brakes, greasing more than 200 bearings, and making the locomotive minimally roadworthy. To get it out of the parking lot, they spliced a switch into the adjacent commuter rail line and used 40-foot sections of temporary track laid end-to-end across the pavement, moving the sections forward in sequence as the locomotive crossed each one, a leapfrog across the asphalt. 2 diesel locomotives towed 4014 east at 30 miles per hour. It arrived in Cheyenne in May 2014. The formal restoration team, led by Ed Dickinsger, Union Pacific's senior manager of heritage operations, began disassembly that year. The 2 articulated engine sets were separated by removing the 450-pound hinge pin. New springs replaced the old suspension throughout. A new cab was fabricated with modern safety and communications equipment. The fuel system was converted from coal to No. 5 oil, cleaner and logistically simpler for a touring locomotive that crosses multiple railroad operating territories. On May 1, 2019, Locomotive 4014 moved out of the Cheyenne Roundhouse under its own power for the first time since July 21, 1959. The restoration cost has never been officially disclosed by Union Pacific. Independent estimates from railroad journalists range from $4 to $7 million. The federal government spent $66 million to preserve 4012 in place. A private railroad spent between $4 and $7 million to make 4014 run again. Which brings us to the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. The question is not whether Steamtown was worth building. The Roundhouse is real, the collection is real, the Ranger programs and the Technology Museum and the working turntable are all real. Locomotive 4012 is genuinely one of 8 surviving examples of the rarest steam locomotive class in American history, and the National Park Service has kept it in good condition. The question is what it means that the institution created specifically to honor these machines responded to 4014's return to service by giving 4012 a cosmetic restoration, not a mechanical one. In October 2019, Steamtown removed 4012 from public display for work, rusted parts replaced, hazardous materials from the original construction remediated, and a new coat of paint applied. The National Park Service press release dated the removal specifically to 2019, the year 4014 ran for the first time since 1959. 4012 returned to static exhibition in May 2021. The press release used the phrase static exhibition twice in the same paragraph. There are no plans to restore Locomotive 4012 to operating condition. Steamtown does, however, have the roundhouse, the turntable, the restoration infrastructure, and the technical capacity to service 4014 during the June 17th through June 30th layover. It is one of the few facilities outside the Union Pacific Steam Shop in Cheyenne capable of handling a boiler wash on a machine of this scale. The working machine uses the museum as a maintenance stop, which is why, from June 17th through June 30th, the visitor flow at Steamtown is physically sequential. The queue walks past locomotive 4012 on the way to locomotive 4014. Every person who stands between them is crossing 65 years of divergent history in the space of a few hundred feet. On June 15th and 16th, the public display days, Steamtown Ranger Megan Stevens has projected 50,000 to 60,000 visitors. For context, Steamtown's normal annual attendance is approximately 60,000 visitors per year. That is what both locomotives are worth, arriving in the same yard at the same time. The chalk worker who named them never knew either number. He named a machine being built in a factory in Schenectady in 1941 for reasons that had nothing to do with preservation or politics or $66 million congressional earmarks. He was working. The machine was being assembled around him. He picked up a piece of chalk because the engine was enormous and the name seemed obvious. He wrote 2 words on the smoke box and walked back to his station. He was working in the same factory where 4012 and 4014 were built in the same month of the same year. Within a decade, both machines would haul wartime freight across the western United States. Within 20 years, both would be retired. Within a year of retirement, they would be sent to 2 different places for 2 different reasons, and the distance between those 2 places, the dry air of Southern California versus the wet winters of the Northeast, would determine which machine proved what the class could do and which machine became the evidence that the class mattered enough to save. The accident and the decision. They share a rail yard starting June 17th for the first time since both locomotives left Schenectady in 1941. The museum built around the static one is where the working one stops for maintenance. That is the whole story. If that distinction matters to you, subscribe to American Iron Works.